Pour yourself a sweet tea, pull up a lawn chair, and turn the page with us. You're listening to Right On Mississippi, a podcast taking you inside the minds of America's most treasured wordsmiths. I'm Ebony Lumumba, and Right On Mississippi is produced in partnership with Mississippi Public Broadcasting for the Mississippi Book Festival, the South's literary lawn party. Today I'm talking to Casey Sepp. Hi, Casey.
Hi, Ebony. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here, literally being here in Mississippi. And you're not from here. You're from Maryland. She's got this amazing new novel coming out in May.
Came out Tuesday.
Oh, today? It's May now.
It's out in the world.
Yeah. I don't know when you guys are listening to this, but it's now May, and this is out in the world. Furious Hours. And so what Casey has done is put together a book filled with gnarly facts and really intense realities about a lot of different people, but mostly Harper Lee, who we all know from To Kill a Mockingbird. But I'm interested in how we get to know her differently in this work. And then, of course, I'm interested in knowing more about you, Casey. So let's just start with, origin story of you. You're not from Mississippi. Where are you from?
I was born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I live one county over from where my parents raised us. And so I'm not from Mississippi and I'm not from Alabama, but I feel like both with this story, which is set around Lake Martin and a lot of small towns in Coosa and Tallapoosa County, and even with, Mockingbird, the story of Macomb, which was based on where Harper Lee was born and raised in Monroeville, I'm not from the South, but I feel like a certain kinship to those small southern towns because of where I grew up. And it's part of the reason I loved Mockingbird as a kid is, that rural childhood felt pretty familiar to me.
Nice. So kind of what you're telling us is that you were drawn to the region because you saw similarities to your own upbringing, and then you've got this sort of affinity for Harper Lee. Talk to me about we all read To Kill a Mockingbird probably in the 6th or 7th grade. And I gotta say, I wasn't encouraged to go further with who Harper Lee was. But what pushed you to write beyond just kind of what she put on the page into her reality and what she was producing?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you didn't take To Kill a Mockingbird. It is one of these books that millions of people are assigned, in middle school, and they read it in this collective experience of childhood. But a lot of folks return to it as adults and read it with their children. And for some of them, it's their first experience of, a courtroom drama, or for a lot of white folks who are privileged never to have lived through it, they feel like they get to know racism for the first time. So it certainly had an effect when it came out in 1960. But I imagine, you're of a generation where there are other books we read as children to kind of experience those things and process them. And for me as a kid, though, I think, again, it was not the kind of famous courtroom scene that appealed to me. It was really this interesting triad of childhood, a little girl named Scout, a tomboy, and I was a tomboy, and her brother Jim, and this friend of theirs, Dill, who comes to visit for the summer. So I was in it for those childhood scenes. And again, it felt like the small town life I was living with two sisters, and we got into adventures, and, we paraded around town and looked for wild things in the woods and made a drama out of anybody we didn't know, and, followed other people's
scandalized
business.
People's
Exactly. So that was what drew me to it. And I think that, like a lot of people who'd loved that novel, in 2015 when Go Set a Watchman was announced, I was shocked, because the one thing we all knew about Harper Lee was she's never going to publish another book. And then she up and announced she was publishing another book.
And people were floored.
Exactly.
And to it.
So it was interesting to me. I went down to Monroeville for the New Yorker to report on that announcement. And while I was down there, the world was consumed by that manuscript she'd written in 1958. But while I was there, I learned about this other project she had undertaken in the 70s, in the prime of her life. And it was interesting to me for a lot of reasons, but chiefly because it was nonfiction. So it was a real life story that she sunk her teeth into and tried to turn into a book. And the truth is, the original crime story, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, is interesting enough. It would have been interesting even if she'd never taken an interest, but being she had such interesting ideas about true crime and about how we should talk about violence and how courtroom drama should be reported, and, how we should get into characters like, supposedly good lawyers and supposedly bad ministers. That was all interesting to me. And I wanted to know more about her life. And in some ways, you know, it was just a mystery I wanted to solve. Whatever happened to this other book that Harper Lee had tried to write?
So you were solving a mystery, a mystery about her book.
Yeah,
on a mystery.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of what hooked me. And, you know, I studied English in college, and I love to read.
Kindred spirit here.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So I just felt like, you know, it was ultimately, this was partly going to be a book about how writers work and how they choose their stories and what makes it hard or easy for them to write. And so that felt like familiar territory to me, even though it was down in Alabama.
Yeah, even though it was down in Alabama. And even though we're over in Mississippi, we still say down in Alabama.
Well, I gather, I mean, that's a rivalry that's palpable.
It's almost a sibling rivalry.
Yeah,
like, we are obviously the same people, but you know, we just got to push back against that. So, you know, it seems as if with the work that you've been doing, specifically with this piece, that you find some personal connection, and then it kind of flows from that or grows from that. So I know that you've got a background in theology, which I think is remarkably interesting. And you're writing this book about Harper Lee's sort of interest in this bad minister, right?
Yes.
Willie Maxwell, who I feel like I knew a couple of Willie Maxwells.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So you brought your own personal experience to the book.
For sure. But this concept of bad ministers, which, you know, we see that all the time, but it's always shocking.
Yeah, and that's
every time we're shocked.
You're absolutely right, and it is one of the tensions of the book, because on the one hand, the Reverend's ordination is part of what protected him initially from scrutiny, and it was one of the reasons people found it so hard to believe that he could have been involved in the murder of one of his wives, but then, you know, wife two turns up dead under similarly suspicious circumstances. And it turns from a story about a man of the cloth who's maybe been framed or just suffered a loss like Job into a story that is also familiar to us, which is the hypocritical minister. So somebody whose sermons don't match up to his life. And that's everything from illegitimate children to debts around town and
all of the skeletons.
Right, exactly. And I think that, you know, for me, I did study theology, but I grew up in the Lutheran church, and you know, it was always interesting to think about people you knew in the sanctuary and how they conducted themselves in the world. And we're all hypocrites to some extent.
Sure.
You know, we're not as generous as Jesus called us to be. And, right. You know, and that's just human anthropology. But of course, I don't mean to put most of us on par with the allegations against the Reverend, and that's where it becomes, to your point, a scandal.
Most of us don't, you know, kill family members for insurance money.
Right. Or
as
even,
tempting as that might be.
Oh gosh. Well, you said it, not me. But yes, I should just say, though, you know, the Reverend before this murder business was just renowned in a way rural preachers can be. You know, people flocked to hear his sermons, and he was exceptionally erudite and just a gifted public speaker. And it was part of why this story was such a scandal in town, because, again, you had someone who was well known for his suits and for his elegant way of talking and his eloquent speech. And again, that
who sort of lifted that community
totally
right? Out of its ruralness, out of its sort of the way that people think about small towns in Alabama and Mississippi is backwards, is, you know, not progressive. Right. Willie Maxwell was the antithesis of that.
Absolutely. You know, he's someone who truly rose beyond his circumstances. And for my mind, you know, I knew this was a sensational story, but I hope that folks sit with the Reverend's childhood, because, of course, everybody has a story before they're accused of crime.
Absolutely.
And in his case, you know, he had a very circumscribed life. His father was a sharecropper. His mother was a housekeeper. He had limited opportunities compared to someone like Harper Lee. And, you know, he was born into what was quickly, you know, solidifying as the Jim Crow South. So here was a man who was, you know, registered for the draft and sent, but could not have the same kind of Army career his lawyer would ultimately have. You know, he was never eligible for the JAG Corps. The government was never going to send him to law school.
Absolutely.
And he comes home, you know, despite having this eloquence, despite being called to the ministry, you know, what does he go and do? He has to go to work at a textile mill. And what does he have to do? He works at a rock quarry. And he works pulpwooding. You know, he was never going to own, he was never...
Sort of inheritable trauma.
Exactly.
That decides his condition.
Absolutely. And again, you know, I think that some people, when they talk about financial crime, we're primed to talk about white-collar criminals as entrepreneurial. And whatever else you could say about the Reverend Maxwell, he was entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
He found a loophole in a system and
which was criminal in itself for a black man in that space in that time.
Exactly.
Just to want to thrive
to
in
want
business.
Money. Exactly. Yeah. To want money, to want opportunity. And I think that, again, that's one aspect of this story. It's been talked about a lot in this part of Alabama, but I hope even for people, maybe they lived through it or they heard about the Reverend, I hope they sit and think about the kind of larger forces operating on his life, because we're trained to do that with someone like Harper Lee. We think about what it was like for women before, feminism took hold and how someone like that could go to college and start a literary career. Right. But I hope that they sit again with someone like the Reverend Maxwell and think about what it was like to be so bright and to have such ambitions but not know how to pursue them in the world.
That is so fascinating, and I think it's a wonderful entry point to this work, not to go in looking for the sort of salacious trial and the alleged crimes, but thinking about how society creates these circumstances and how we all have sort of a chapter that may be looked upon as shameful, that we might be ashamed of, but these survival tactics that are not always sanctioned by law, perhaps.
Right. And I was especially mindful of that. Again, this is a community where the Reverend has descendants, the lawyer has descendants. These are people who still live and breathe in these spaces. And obviously this is a story that was experienced very differently by very different people. And nowhere is that more pronounced than in the trial of the vigilante who, some people thought was a hero. So the Reverend was gunned down at the funeral of his last alleged victim. And, some people just wanted to have a parade for the man who shot him. But of course, the Reverend had children. He had siblings. There were people.
And a whole community of parishioners.
Right. And a whole community of parishioners.
Still needed him as a figurehead to believe in,
baptized or married or buried their parents, and their faith was caught up in the persona of a minister, as is often the case. So, I just think it's one of these things that, again, the kind of tabloid version is too simplistic. And one of the things I hope the book does is treat everyone's story respectfully and thoughtfully, and that includes the kind of serial killer at the heart of this.
I love that. I mean, it sort of just says to me that we're acknowledging the humanity of people, and because we may not agree with people's decisions or actions doesn't make them any less human. Right. So I think that is a huge undertaking to sort of try to get at in a small town in Alabama in this time period. I mean, I don't think those are conversations that we're even having today. Sure. In a lot of cities, especially some southern cities.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, a lot of people ask me questions about why Harper Lee couldn't write this book and what was hard for her. Yeah. And I think there's a really straightforward one that we don't sit with enough, which is she was a white writer of privilege, and she came to sit with some, indigent black folks in Coosa County, and that's one of the poorest counties in Alabama. And I think she was a deeply empathetic person, and she was good at listening and good at answering questions. But, she had a real hurdle, and that started with the kinds of lives she was trying to represent in the book. And I think that some were more accessible to her than others. And, that is everything from, the life of a sharecropper in 1925 to the life of a black serviceman in the 1940s. Because even if her brother served in the Army, even if he had a brother in the Army, his experience was different than the Reverend Maxwell's. 100%. Or than Robert Burns, the vigilante, exactly, who served in Vietnam. So even those kind of small points of access are fraught for her. And I think, if we take the life of the Reverend seriously, we got to take the experience of the writer seriously and think about, some of these door knocks she did were, into black homes she would never have visited if she weren't reporting on them. And the same thing was true for me to some extent.
I was going to ask.
Some of these parts of Alabama where, most of us, when we visit Alabama, maybe we stop in Selma, maybe
Montgomery,
maybe we go to Montgomery, and we look at the kind of heroes of the civil rights movement, but we don't think about the kind of everyday lives that participated or, marched behind the Reverend King, or even who didn't march at all because they live in a town the movement passed by. So I think that was, again, kind of one of the rich experiences of the book for me, and, partly thinking about what made it hard for Harper Lee made it a little easier for me. And to your point, I benefit from a lot of contemporary conversations and contemporary scholarship. There's just a lot more, I think in terms of the facts. You were talking about gnarly facts. Yeah. And I think we all learn this kind of triumphant story of the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
And we learn, with real optimism about the thousands of black voters who were registered in places like Macon County. We don't learn about the white backlash to that.
Oh,
and
gosh.
when I thought about, this
How
book
horrific.
tells a story of kind of a liberal politician in the Wallace years, and you think, well, why couldn't he do it? Macon County was in his district. And then you realize, white voter participation surged to 97% as a backlash against black voter registration at that time.
Yeah.
So it's, again, I was shocked. I started this book, and I started it in 2015, and then was down in Alabama reporting during the Doug Jones election for Senate.
Okay.
And you just have no idea how contemporary 60s and 70s Alabama felt to the conversations people were having then. So it was very interesting, and I hope a part of the book that even if you're from Alabama or you're from the South, you can revisit your own history in an interesting way.
I think so. I mean, it's certainly what I've found myself able to do. And it sounds to me like you're saying when Harper Lee was in the midst of gathering information, doing research, and pinning down this story, it just wasn't time to tell the story that she may have wanted to tell.
Yeah, and certainly, if folks have had a chance to read Go Set a Watchman, there's been a very interesting conversation even about the character of Atticus Finch. So, rightfully a paragon of lawyerly courage. And, I can't tell you the number of people I meet who tell me their son is named Atticus, or they became an attorney because of Atticus. And what Go Set a Watchman did was expose us to this kind of later in life version. Now, it was a prequel, so she wrote it before, even though it aged the characters up. But, he's basically a Dixiecrat. And he's joined the White Citizens Council. And I think that, the kind of knee-jerk reaction folks had of, oh gosh, now he's racist, actually underestimates Harper Lee's kind of skill as a writer and sophisticated way of looking at political change. Because in fact, what she was trying to do was give a more nuanced view of kind of everyday racism and the systemic ways in which we all come to hold our beliefs. So nobody feels like a racist for the most part.
I certainly don't want to acknowledge that, but...
Right. And so looking at a character like Atticus, who is, an honorable man, a quote, honorable man in his community, but who still wants to, control black opportunity, and who maybe is okay.
Feels entitled to do that.
Feels entitled to do so. Doesn't even feel like it's violative to say, well, our schools are going to be run a certain way, and, our churches are going to be run another. And I think it's so interesting. That's why, so the book I wrote is basically, the lives of three characters, and one is the Reverend, and one is his lawyer, and one is Harper Lee. I think that's the reason it felt so critical to me that I include the life of Tom Rodney. So he is this white liberal in the Wallace years in Alabama, and he didn't get integration right at the very first moment, but he got it right, and he got it right when the court mandated it. And it was the end of his political career, the extent to which he got it right, and the extent to which he was willing to represent black clients. And Tom lived a very long life, lived long enough to be writing pro-Obama letters to the editor in the local paper. And I think that there are a lot of ways these characters kind of contrast each other. And Tom's clear-eyed politics is one way that, he kind of challenges Harper Lee. And it's interesting to think about the conversations they might have had. Here was a writer who was credited as being at the vanguard of civil rights, but who never marched, who never spoke publicly in favor of the movement, and whose views, it seems, were actually a little more complicated. And so I think that, it's a nice conversation between these characters, not that anybody is a saint, not that anybody is, an outright villain, but they critique and challenge one another in very interesting ways. And that's why, Tom's political career, he goes to the 68 Democratic Convention. He tries to nominate Teddy Kennedy. This guy is a liberal.
And wrote the book on it, apparently.
Totally. And, I just feel like he was a liberal in kind of grandstanding ways, but a liberal in personal ways that, I can't think of a kind of more interesting story than a man who, when the schools integrated in Tallapoosa County, and they were late to do so, a lot of people kept their kids home that day. And in fact, the superintendent of the schools didn't go to school that day. But Tom told his daughter, there are going to be some black kids at your school today, and they're going to be scared. And you let them know you're a friend to them. And that's a part of the book. Again, we talk about...
That's remarkable.
We talk about huge social changes and the differences people can make, in the legislature or in
Those
the
very
church.
human moments.
Exactly.
It's very small.
Exactly. And you set that moment against some of the others in the book. And, I hope it's moving for people to just revisit that history. And the same way you think about, well, how would I have decided if I were on a jury with the Reverend Maxwell, sit and think, well, what would I have told my kids? Would I have even sent them to school that day? Or from the perspective of, readers of color, do I recognize the Tom Rodneys in my town? Are there any? And what do they look like today?
To the, different Tom Rodneys, if we're talking about like white liberalism, and there are layers to that, and that manifests in so many different ways. But I think, we tend to clump people up and categorize in ways that, give us ease, but they don't really represent truly what individuals are capable of.
Right. And the kind of code switching that goes on between those spheres. And, that's what I loved about Tom. It's so clear, for instance, here's a man who never flew a Confederate flag. Never. Not even in his childhood. But you go and you look at his speeches and, he could talk that way in certain towns. And, he would say. And had to, right.
Or be run out or,
Right. Or just didn't stand a chance of getting in the legislature. So again, you got no saints in this book, but you've got people who are leading pragmatic lives and making their way through the world. And, to some extent, like forming new politics, right? Like to your point, there are gradations and we hold different beliefs and our beliefs evolve. And so I think one thing that's nice is because we get to follow, these people intersect, the reverend, the lawyer, and the writer at one specific moment, but you get to see a little bit of where they came from and where they were going, and they change. And that's true probably the most of Harper Lee, who I think some of us feel like, that book came out in 1960, but Mockingbird was set in the 30s. So she's this anachronistic writer where we feel like maybe she died when the book, she died before the book was even out or something, but she lives until 2016. She lives through the Obama years, and it's just an incredible amount of American history, right, that she witnesses. And some of her letters let us see kind of what she thought about different periods of American history, but it's another way in which, she just lives a long time. And I hope that for readers who feel like they know her, they learn something because of this kind of private life she lived after Mockingbird.
So in reading Furious Hours, everyone, there is this opportunity to really look in a mirror, right? Really do some deep self-reflection and evaluation. And, Casey's talking about it now, and I think I'm interested in how you started to kind of draw out your own, or these indictments of self as you were doing your research, as you were traveling specifically in Alabama.
Sure.
How did you start to kind of rethink who you were, or how you thought, or how you believed, or did that happen at all?
Sure. Well, I guess I should say, right off the bat, you talk about, we like to put people into categories, and I came down to Alabama and I thought I had my categories for people.
Yeah.
And
which is what we say about Yankees. No, I'm kidding.
Probably. Yeah. It's what we say about our neighbors, right? I say that about my neighbors up in Maryland, and I'm sure down here people from different political parties feel like they know everything about someone else as soon as they know which, ballot they check. And I found myself tremendously humbled by that, meaning people who I expected to think one way, thought a different way, or to have interacted with Harper Lee a certain way, did a different way, or who would love Mockingbird or hate it or have never read it, or, have just despised their liberal neighbor, Tom Rodney, or, that kind of thing. People just surprise you. And I don't mean to suggest that it's all a pleasant surprise, because there are certainly people who will let you in and pour you some tea and get to talking, and then they tell you how they really feel about you when you say where you're from or what your private life is like or how much you have in common with somebody else's politics. So it's not always a pleasant surprise, but
there's danger in
but they surprise you. And I think there's a richness to how people form their political beliefs and their religious beliefs. Again, I'm interested in religion. I was so shocked. One of my favorite sources for the book is a woman who found a letter from Harper Lee in an Encyclopedia Britannica that she bought at a thrift store in town. And
just like as a bookmark, the letter
was in by Harper's Ferry. So that's its own incredible story. But what I'll tell you is she and her family are Mormon. And I went to Mormon worship with them. And to the point that the South will surprise you, I would never have thought I would be going to Mormon worship in Alexander City, Alabama, but there's a Mormon stake. And, there's a source who's interested in genealogy and interested in history. And, like any other aspect of her community's history, she had looked into Harper Lee's time in town. And she was very helpful and gracious. And, you could do that. You go to the Episcopal Church, or you go to the Methodist Church, or you go to a different Methodist church.
Right.
And, people's beliefs are more complicated than you think. And, again, I studied religion for a while, and I grew up in the Lutheran church, and Luther had this kind of perceptive insight into humanity. And you're going to forgive me for a minute for using the Latin. I promise I'll translate it. But Luther said that, everybody was simul justus et peccator, simultaneously saint and sinner. And, I just think that those proportions change.
Simultaneously.
And, somebody seems especially saintly one day or sinner like the next. But that is what I learned when I was coming through, confirmation and reading the Lutheran Catechism. And it's served me well as a reporter, because if you let people, they'll show you the full range of who they are and how they think. And again, I hope that the experience of the book is really, bringing three lives into conversation with one another, and not judging any one more harshly than the other, but looking carefully and critically at all of them.
If we do that, that's really a manual for how we could be looking at, current state of politics and folks who are sort of making their legacy in our contemporary time. Like not giving anyone the benefit of being completely saintly or completely righteous or completely, on the up and up, that we've all got these sort of facets, if you will, that.
Right. Or again, our politics are a whole bushel of issues. And I think that, one of Tom Rodney's most radical positions, he married a school teacher and he was pro public education. And, you would have thought he was proposing, like, I can't even begin to, like, building a colony on Mars, funding the public schools properly.
Completely obscure.
And that's an example of nowadays, I think if we can get past a political label, we would all agree we want well-funded public schools.
Everyone wants their children well-educated. Exactly. Everyone wants to be able to feed their families. Everyone wants to be able to
And so your knee-jerk reaction to I don't want taxes is actually tempered by, well, I don't mind paying a little more to make sure my kids have a good school,
education, good
textbooks, well-educated teacher. And so there's one where I hope, no matter which come in thinking about, a lily-bellied liberal like Tom Rodney, you take a moment and think, what was he actually after? He was after equality. He was after opportunity. He was after making sure that Alabama was not the last in the nation, which I'm sure people in Mississippi wrestle with that kind of talk and expectation. And, so again, whatever you think about who he was or who a man like that is or who a, political talking head like that believes, just sit with a man who was really trying to do right by his community. And that was, again, just the kind of patience I feel like this book taught me, not to assume I know what other people want or what they're motivated by. And I hope that, again, it's something that translates in the book.
My gosh. Within these, within the ends of this book, there's so much opportunity to really be better humans.
Sure. And I think that's why we study history, right? This is a book that if nothing else is right. Yeah. But I know we don't always. Again, one of the things that surprised me was I didn't know much about Alabama history. I think I studied the civil rights movement in high school and college, but I didn't know much about the Creek Wars. Yeah. And you talk about not learning from your history, that was a period of violence and exploitation and relocation. And, some would go so far as to say genocide. And
deep disenfranchisement.
Right. Yeah. At the kind of logistical level, ongoing disenfranchisement. And that was very interesting to think about the kind of archaeology of violence and exploitation. And you get down to that part of it. And that's why, again, I felt like, you couldn't stay at the surface of, well, this is a story about murder. Because actually it's a story about violence. And when you think of it that way, that is as old as Adam.
In so many different ways. I mean, there's epistemic violence, which I think arguably is more damaging as we go generation to generation.
Sure. And environmental violence. This book starts out with a story of, these hydroelectric power plants, which for the most part brought opportunity. And I don't want to say they didn't, I think the story of the TVA is one of the great triumphs of the federal government. But, the Tallapoosa River was dammed and it remade the watershed. And Lake Martin is beautiful. I spent a lot of time there. But that is another kind of violence. And thinking about
that Mississippi had experienced at the same time.
I just drove up from New Orleans. You want to talk about, the violence we're doing to the landscape and the waterways. And again, it's
and how that bleeds over into the people.
Right.
Especially those who don't
and
have
who benefits and who doesn't. That power plant, that dam on the Tallapoosa River, on the one hand brought electricity, but some people made money off of it and some people didn't.
Yes. Yeah.
And some people got to turn on their lights.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, who built it? That was a segregated work camp. And that's why, again, it's like on the one hand, it's just this cinematic moment where they, put up the dam and the river is dammed and then they start flooding the land and it's gorgeous and beautiful and seductive. But hopefully you sit and you think about, okay, well, who built the dam?
Yeah.
And whose farms and houses were lost when Lake Martin flooded?
Who could move above water level?
Who could move to town and what jobs could they get when they got there? So, I feel like, it's bad news if you're in this book for the murdering voodoo preacher, but good news if you like to sit with history.
Murdering voodoo preacher, which, if you had named it that, I don't know.
Different audience. So I hope, I hope that, people like to sit with their history and, their economics.
Name this episode Murdering Voodoo Preacher, by the way.
Alleged. I like that you threw in the alleged, which again, poor Harper Lee was, skulking around town in the 1970s. And she was at one point apparently worried about an accomplice. And then she was worried about getting sued. And so again, interestingly, the Reverend was never convicted of any crime.
Right.
He was tried for murder once, and they were going to try him again, but he was acquitted and, prevailed in over a dozen civil cases. So a lot of juries agreed that he hadn't done anything and agreed that he deserved the life insurance he had. So even there, it's a more complicated case than the newspapers at the time would have you believe.
It's beautifully complicated, which, so is Alabama, and in similar ways, Mississippi is as well. So this is your official invitation to be here in Mississippi more often.
Oh gosh, well, I'd love to come back. Yeah, we're talking about the kind of troubled waters, but I'm so excited to go to the Eudora Welty House, and I've read so much about Richard Wright's time here.
The garden's going to be beautiful today.
Yeah, so. But you guys got your own literary legacy to tend to and draw on and build on.
Most definitely.
So,
most definitely.
It's an honor to be here.
Which I think is made more rich because we're surrounded by folks who thought deeply about life and humanity and experience and identity.
Sure.
Which you have more than done in Furious Hours.
Tried to. Yeah. We'll see.
I think so.
Hopefully folks will read it and give it a shot. And then, I always welcome feedback. So, but no, it's an honor to get to talk to you about it. And I'm so grateful already for the folks who've just spent time thinking about this book and the people in it.
Well, as a lifelong Southerner, I want to thank you for how thoughtful you were in handling the stories of these people's lives. Oftentimes, outsiders, so to speak, can come in and, like you said, project their own expectations onto, the lived experience of people. And so I think what you've done here with Furious Hours is really equitable and truly beautiful.
Gosh, well, thanks so much.
It's beautiful work. So, Casey, this has been a thrill.
Totally. Thanks so much for having me.
Check out Furious Hours, and we hope to invite Casey back to our state. And maybe there's an alleged voodoo preacher here.
Or some other. I take stories of all kinds, so people should pass along stories, not just the true crime ones. So
you're a consummate storyteller, so thank you for telling this story.
Thanks so much.
We want to thank Casey Sepp for joining us today. Be sure to visit your local bookstore to purchase her work and keep up with her online. Right On Mississippi is